Hello, how are you doing? This is Jose Luis here at Parametric Camp, and welcome to another video in our series, Advanced Development in Grasshopper. In this video, what I would like to teach you is how to include and how to work with third-party libraries inside of your native Grasshopper plugins in a very similar way to what we did in a previous video where we loaded external libraries in C# script components, and we were therefore able to power our code with the code that other people have written for us. So in the example that I'm going to do here, I have an input mesh that is a Grasshopper mesh, and then I'm going to convert it to a mesh 3, dmesh3 object from this external library called geometry 3 sharp that has a lot of interesting properties and a lot of interesting functions to do mesh manipulation. So you're going to see that I'm going to convert it into that kind of mesh, and then I'm going to do a remeshing process that is going to allow me to remesh the mesh so that all the edges have a length that is very close to a target length. So you can see that it allows me to fine tune all those vertices, all those meshes, and I think I just broke. Look at this remeshing. It's very nice, right? Beautiful. So the way this is going to look is that I'm going to add these new 3 components, right? And then I'm going to explain a few things, such as, for example, how to work with a generic parameter, which I don't think we've seen so far, and how to encapsulate data and functionality inside of functions, just to make your code cleaner, more reusable, and then easier to work with in the future. All right? Beautiful. So let's get started. Fantastic. Let's get started. So how are we going to do this? Well, what I would like to do is I would like to follow a very similar process to the one that we followed in the mesh components video that we recorded a while ago. And if you don't remember it, there will be a card popping up somewhere in the corner all the way over there, or there will be a link in the description of this video. So what we did in this exercise was we used C# script components to create mesh manipulations, and I actually had the example somewhere here. We did C# script components where we did mesh manipulations, but in order to do these manipulations, we loaded an external library called geometry 3. And what we did was we turned a standard Grasshopper vanilla mesh. We turned it into a dmesh3, which is the type of class that represents meshes in this library that we're using. And then we use the library's functions to do analysis, reduce vertices, reduce triangles, etc., which are very interesting operations that we don't have in vanilla Grasshopper. So what I would like to do in this video is I would like to replicate the component here that we have, the remeshing, which is one of the ones that I find more interesting, right? Which is basically changing the topology of the mesh to target a new set of edge lengths, etc. But in order to do that, we will also need to replicate first the component that takes a standard Grasshopper mesh and turns it into a dmesh3 object. Then we will have to replicate the remeshing component, and then we will have to replicate the component that deserializes a dmesh3 component and turns it back into a mesh that Grasshopper can understand. So we're going to go and do the 3 components. If you remember in the previous video, we did this with C# scripting, and what we did was we managed the assemblies and we loaded the geometry 3 library in this C# script component. We're going to do something very similar, but we're going to do it natively in our plugin. So let's get started. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create here, and I don't know if you can see it, I'm going to create here, I'm going to add a new folder, and I'm going to call this meshes, I guess, or mesh components, for example. Mesh components, to be consistent with the naming that we have used in the past. And then here, I'm going to add a new item, which is going to be of the type empty Grasshopper component, all right? Then I'm going to rename my component, and I'm going to call it, for example, what am I going to call it? I'm going to call it, we're going to do first the mesh to dmesh3. So we're going to convert, so that's going to be mesh to dmesh3 component. And that gets renamed here, it gets renamed here. And then I'm going to call this mesh 2D mesh 3. And the nickname is going to be mesh 2D mesh 3, for example. And then converts Grasshopper mesh to a G3D mesh 3. Okay? And in categories and subcategories, I forget what were we doing. So pcamp and nerve. So I guess this is going to be pcamp, which is the name of the library, and this is going to be meshes, for example. Right? Nerves, meshes, in vectors, we had vectors, so I guess it's going to be called mesh. All right? Beautiful. I'm very lazy when it comes to typing these things, so I'm just going to copy a lot here. So I'm going to say the input is going to be, it's actually not, I'm going to have to type it here. So the input is going to have to be a mesh parameter. So that's going to be something that takes a mesh as an input. The name is going to be, for example, mesh. The nickname is going to be M. And then the description is going to be Grasshopper mesh, for example. And then the access is going to be item, because for each mesh that we take in, we're going to turn it into one D mesh 3 mesh. Okay, I'm going to make this a little bigger. And then here in P Manager, so I would like to add another parameter. This is going to be the output one. But for this one, what's interesting is that the output is going to be a type that does not exist in the Grasshopper or the Rhino API. What that means is that we cannot say here add parameter, add mesh 3 parameters, because that does not exist. The way to handle this in the API is that to add a generic parameter or an object, there's no object, it's generic. Add a generic parameter. What that means is that it's going to output an object of any type, and we don't have to, we will deal with what that looks like after in the next, in the components that come afterwards. All right. So that's going to be, for example, the mesh 3, and then the nickname is going to be DM3, and then the converted the mesh 3 object, for example. And then this is also going to be of the type item. Okay, beautiful. And then in solve instance, I would like to do something very similar to what we have here. So I would like to create a mesh from all this stuff here. So to start with, I think what we will need to do is we will need to basically get the data. So that's going to be, for example, the mesh is going to start as a new mesh, or it's going to be null, for example. And then if, what were we doing here? I forget what were we doing. DA get data. So we're going to get the data from index 0, and ref is going to be the mesh. All right. All right, beautiful. So once we have the mesh, I want to turn the mesh into a dmesh3 object. What I would actually like to do is, since I already have the function here that I created before in the previous video, why don't I just copy and paste this directly? Because this is the beautiful thing about making functions for things, that then the code becomes very reusable and very encapsulated. So I'm going to copy this function here, and I'm going to add it right here. So I'm going to have a function. This is going to be also protected. It's going to be part of this component, all right? And it's going to be a function that takes a mesh and turns it into a dmesh3. And as you can see right now, this is complaining big time because it doesn't understand what a dmesh3 object is. It's not part of the API. So at this point is when we need to make our project aware of the existence of this new object called a dmesh3 object. How are we going to do that? We're going to do that by loading the library that we're using, the Geometry 3 library, into our Visual Studio project. So if I go to my Grasshopper plugin, to the actual files that we have here, you can see that I have the project files, and then I have a bunch of folders, and now I have mesh components, and I have the C# file that I'm working on, etc., etc. A very common method for for managing libraries in your projects that you're managing manually, because remember, we're not using NuGet packages or anything, we're just straight up managing our own library, is basically to create a folder. I'm going to call this libraries, and then just copy pasting there all the files that we're using that we're referencing in our project. If you remember from the previous video, what I did was I downloaded from the Geometry 3 Sharp library, I downloaded the project, and then I built the DLL myself. So I do have the DLL somewhere in my system, and therefore I'm just going to copy paste the DLL right there. Okay? And as you can see, this DLL is now showing up here. Sorry, is now showing up here, correct? But I still get the same error. So the only thing that's changing is that I do have access. I can see my folder, my library here. The problem is that my Visual Studio project is not aware that this library should be loaded as part of code that should be available in the project. So the next step that I need to do is I need to go to dependencies and I need to go to assemblies. And this part here is where in my Visual Studio project, I make the project aware of all the things that I want to have available code-wise in my project. So what I'm going to do here is in dependencies, I'm going to add the assembly reference to my project. Okay? So I right click on dependencies, I do assembly reference, and then instead of using any of the standard .NET framework dependencies, what I want is a manual to load a manual file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to browse, and then I'm going to click here on browse, and I'm going to go to where my project is. So that's going to be on my desktop. I have a link to the parametric camp. No, what is this? Sorry, let me take a second here. Yes, it was in my desktop here on the parametric camp plugin, and you can see that there's libraries, and then there is the Geometry 3 library. As I double click there and I click OK, you can see that Geometry 3 is now available in my project, which is great, right? But I'm still getting the same problem here. So what do I do now? Well, the only thing that I need to do is I need to remember that I need to make that library accessible and available in the file that I'm working with. If you remember in C# scripting, we did the import the library using the using keyword. So we're going to do the same here. We're just going to say, I want to use G3, and you can see how the namespace already shows up because it's available here. So G3, and as I do that, hopefully these errors have gone, okay? And then I'm just going to remove that, which was an error, okay? And you can see that now I have the function that takes a mesh and converts it into a dmesh3, correct? Beautiful. So that's pretty much it. That's how you load a library in Grasshopper. That's how you load a library when you're building an actual native plugin in Grasshopper. So I'm going to finish building these components, and then we're going to talk by the end of the video on issues of distribution and issues of licensing. But let me build this. So I'm going to say, for example, dmesh. I'm going to build a component. So dmesh3 is going to be convert mesh, and that's going to be the mesh that I took in. And then, for example, set data and parameter index object data is going to be dmesh3. All right. And I'm going to save this. I'm going to kickstart. I'm going to run the project. And if you remember from previous videos, I had linked it so that it dynamically now loads a file that I'm using as a test bench called components, right? And with my file attached. And you can see that if I now go to, where did I have this? pcamp, all right? If I now go to mesh, you can see mesh to dmesh3, all right? And then I guess we have to load a mesh here. So can I copy this into my components somewhere here? All right, and then can I sorry, can I load a, I'm a little rusty as of the recording of this video. Can I load that mesh here? And then I'm going to hide it. And then I'm going to plug it in here. And you can see that if I plug a panel now, you can see that this is a native object of the type G3 mesh 3, which is great. Now it's working fantastically. Okay, beautiful. So let me quickly build those two other components that we were missing. I'm going to do this offline and I'm going to show you what it looks like right now. Nice. So we implemented this and it's working. There was a lot of typing going on, so I saved this from you, the viewer, right now. But if you want to see how I actually typed all of this and how I wrote it, there should be a link to the live stream where I was recording this video. It should be popping as a card or somewhere over there, or there should be a link here in the description of this video. Okay? So what you can see is that I have mimicked what we used to have in the other example. But what I've done is I took a mesh, then I am converting it to a dmesh3 object, then I am doing the remeshing based on some target length, and then I'm converting the dmesh3 object back into a mesh that I can render inside of Grasshopper, and I can further operate, 3D print, whatever. And you can see that it's kind of working because the remeshing now from the original mesh is giving me more vertices and more faces. Okay, you can see there's like a clear kind of difference between the original one and the one with the faces, the edges that are much shorter. Okay, so how have I done this? Basically, I created the mesh to D3 mesh component that you already saw. Then I created the inverse, which was a component that takes a dmesh3 object and turns it into a mesh. This is getting very complicated. And the only thing that I would like to highlight here is that remember that just like the output here was a generic object, because Grasshopper does not understand, does not have an API for the mesh 3 objects, the input here must be a generic one. And the output was a regular mesh. And I also did the conversion by creating this one function that takes a dmesh3 objects and return a regular one. And it does the conversion using the vertices and using the faces. And then, yeah, for the remeshing, I followed a very, very similar logic. I created a component with a generic input for the dmesh3, number and integer, and then a generic output for the dmesh3. Everything that is not native Grasshopper components, they need to be handled, the inputs and the outputs, with generic parameters. And then I also encapsulated everything that was the remeshing operation inside of a function. Okay? And then the component, the solver, was just basically simply loading the inputs and then remeshing the mesh and outputting it in by the output. Okay, so if you want to learn more again about how I do this, watch the live stream or just take a look at the code, which there will be a link published to the source code in the description of this video, okay, in our GitHub repository. Now, one topic that I need to address that is very important is now, how do you actually distribute this? Because when this building a plugin works, because when you hit play and you hit execute, what happens is that you're basically in your project folder, you're basically building this file called the GHA file, which is the file that you distribute as your plugin, which I'm not sure if we have talked about this, but we will talk about this in a second, all right, in further videos. But this also works because something that is happening is that your Visual Studio project, when it produces this Grasshopper GHA file, which is your plugin, right? It's also doing this operation where next to the file, it's copying the geometry 3 DLL that is a dependency of our project. And this is very important for you to keep in mind, because if you're building a plugin, you probably intend to distribute this plugin to people in the world at some point, right? So because you're now using an external library, a third-party library, to power some of the operations that you're doing, you need to remember, and this is super important, you need to remember that With the distribution of your plugin file, you also have to distribute the DLL file, because you cannot assume that this DLL will be available to whoever downloads this plugin and uses it in their own computers. There is a very, very strong likelihood that that will not be the case. So that's why, remember, whenever you distribute or you package this into a zip file or you upload it to Yak for people to download, you need to include any DLLs that your project depends on. And this is the reason why, for example, if you go to Grasshopper, this is, for example, my Grasshopper libraries in my computer. You can see that if you go to Millipede, there's a ton of DLL libraries. If you go to Mesh Edit, there's a bunch of DLL libraries too. If you go to Firefly, there's a lot of DLLs, because all these plugins are loading libraries to power and to fuel some of the work that they do. Okay, so remember, if you use third-party libraries, you need to bundle them with your plugin, which leads me to the next consideration that is very important to keep in mind here. When you distribute code, you need to make sure that you have the permission and the rights to do that distribution. Because we are working in a community where a lot of us support open source code and free distribution of code, etc., etc. But we need to make sure that if we do that, we do it legally and we do it with the consent of the people who have made that code available for us. So for example, a case for this particular example that we did is that if we go to the GitHub repo of Geometry 3 Sharp, which is the library that we are loading, we need to make sure that we can distribute this file with our plugin. We first need to make sure that that's possible. So the first thing that I would look is I would go to the license file and I would read what kind of permissions do I have with this license. And you can see that if I read through the code, it says me like permission is granted free of charge to anyone with a copy, blah, 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 to use, reproduce, display, and distribute. All of these are the ones that we're interested in, the software, and to prepare derivative works and to permit third parties, blah, 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 subject to the following. The copyright notes of this environment, blah, 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 needs to be distributed with your plugin, with your software. All right, so this is great. So as a summary, I can use it for commercial, modified, distributed, and private use. No guarantees of any kind, but so long as I distribute it with a copyright notice, this one here. All right, so if I want to do things the right, good way, what I need to do is I need to make sure that with my plugin and with my files, I also include the license of this Geometry 3 library. The way to do that is very easy. I can just go here to the raw file, I can copy all this code, and then here I'm going to write a new text document. I'm going to call it geometry 3 underscore license. Okay, and I'm going to open a new, I'm going to open it in a text editor, for example. I'm just going to drag it here, and then I'm going to paste that license there. And even if I included a link, that would probably be nice, like a link to the repo. I'm just going to do that. Why not? Where am I? I'm just going to make sure that, yes, here, and then there you go. Why not? Okay. And that's it. And now, whenever I say, okay, I'm ready to share this with the world, I'm going to make a zip file, I need to make sure that the zip file includes at least all of this, which is, for example, this is the pcamp plugin, which includes the DLL, the license, and the plugin file. All right. This would be the right, legal, and ethical way of doing this. Just make sure that whenever you distribute and share DLLs or code, you have the permissions to do that. And if the author asks you to do anything with that, just make sure that you distribute, for example, this is a very common thing, to distribute the copyright notice with your plugins. Okay. Beautiful. Alrighty, so we can now use third-party libraries in our Grasshopper plugins. And this is actually a very common thing because there's a ton of DLLs out there that are super useful, a lot of fun. And by wrapping them in Grasshopper components, it's a very easy and very useful way of providing people in Grasshopper with the possibility of using things that other people have coded for other platforms. Okay? So if you want to write a Grasshopper plugin that is basically a port of someone else's DLL, it's a very common and very easy thing to do. Okay, fantastic. So I think that was it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you found this useful, click, 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 like, comment, say hi, and all those things. And see you on the next video on this series, where I believe we're going to take a look at a very nifty... Wait, I forgot to do something. I forgot to do something. Wait. How are we going to do this? Yes, sorry, I forgot I wanted to do something in this video, but since I'm already done, it's going to be a little disruptive to now do it now. So I'm going to include a tiny bit of code that I wanted to explain in the next video when we talk about sharing data between components, like a very nifty and interesting technique that you're going to enjoy. Okay? All right, fantastic. See you in a bit. Bye-bye.